Welcome to our May 2022 episode of In Search of Civility. I'm Jeremy Field and I'll be moderating today's discussion with my co-host Kelly Packer. Before we introduce our guests, let me share you a little bit about the background of In Search of Civility. The series is an innovative partnership between the Association of Idaho Cities and the Boise Metro Chamber. We started this series in 2021 and remain committed to discussing the challenges facing our state and communities. In Search of Civility begins with the idea that truth exists and cannot be found without a sincere exchange of ideas. Civility and discourse, we believe, is the necessary grease for advancement and preservation of relationships, institutions, and society. To agree, one must first disagree well. Listening actively to key stakeholders, giving your opponents political respect, the benefit of the doubt, empathy, and sympathy for their motives. Ultimately, civility gives us the opportunity for our own ideas and notions to change, bringing improvement to our own lives and even society as a whole. We believe civil dialogue can affect great change, which is why we strive to help important conversations take place. These conversations are not possible, however, without the help of our partners. Thank you to our media partners, Idaho Ed News, the Idaho Statesman and Idaho Press, as well as the Idaho Capital Sun. They provide us a platform and audience with whom we can interact. Joining us today are two special guests from the Attorney General's Office and the Idaho Public Television. Kelly, tell us a bit more about our guests today.
Thank you, Jeremy. It is my pleasure to introduce Melissa Davlin, as well as Deputy Attorney General Brian Kane. Melissa is a writer and producer for Idaho Public Television and host of Idaho Reports. Melissa also produces for IBTV's history documentary series, Idaho Experience. She previously worked at the Twin Falls Times-News and has won multiple awards, including an Emmy for her documentary on Chinese immigration in the Northwest, the 2018 Broadcast Reporter of the Year from the Idaho Press Club, and the 2019 Enhancing Public Discourse Award from Boise State University. Brian Kane was hired as Deputy Attorney General in the Intergovernmental and Fiscal Law Division of the Office of the Attorney General. He was promoted to lead Deputy Attorney General for that division in 2004. 1 year later, Brian was again promoted to Assistant Chief Deputy Attorney General. In 2021, he was promoted to Chief Deputy. Brian serves as legal counsel to the Secretary of State, the legislature, and other elected officials. He acts as a liaison between the Attorney General and local, state, and federal governments, and he handles all of amicus requests. He has argued before the Idaho Supreme Court and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. As legal counsel to the legislature, Brian also serves as counsel to the ethics committees of the Idaho legislature. During the legislature's orientation and ethics training for legislators, Brian is one of the primary presenters. He has trained attorneys general and assistant attorneys general nationally and at the state level on the subject matter of ethics, professionalism, and civility. Brian has authored legislation, constitutional amendments, and numerous legal articles. He serves as a faculty member for the National Attorneys General Training and Research Institute and conducts continuing legal education training on diverse topics throughout the country and internationally. In 2012, Brian was recognized by the Idaho State Bar with an Outstanding Service Award and by NAAG through his selection as an International Fellow. In 2013, Brian received the NAAG-NAGTRI Faculty of the Year Award and the Nelson Kempsky Award for Management and Leadership from the Conference of Western Attorneys General. In 2017, Brian received the NAAG Attorney General Senior Staff of the Year Award. In 2018, Brian became a member of the Law Advisory Council for the University of Idaho School of Law. Brian is an avid runner, having completed the Portland, Chicago, and St. George marathons, the Race to Roby Creek half marathon 13 times, and the Hood to Coast Relay 5 times. Brian is a 4.0 USTA tennis player. He is also a United States Soccer Federation E-licensed coach, as well as a youth basketball coach. Brian and his wife, Emily, were married in 2002 and have 2 children. We'd like to welcome both of our special guests. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
You know, before we started the program, Brian was telling us, please read my short bio, but I don't think you would have gotten the full picture there. I mean, I know we need to go back and find Melissa's long bio now because I enjoy getting to know everyone just a little bit better about those bios. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. To start our discussion today, we want to talk a little bit about confidence in the media. And that's a story that you see with a lot of media watchdogs out there that work for different outlets and talking about different things. But in a 2021 Gallup poll, it showed that the media had hit the second lowest trust level in history, nearly as low as Congress. Now, Congress, what we also saw was just, and this will lead into a further discussion, but we saw that the state government saw a 10-point a higher confidence rating than Congress. And then as you got to municipal leadership at your city and county levels, you saw another 10 plus percentage in confidence points. And we thought that was a really curious trend. But just speaking to just solely about why there's this low trust in media when people are asked that question for the Gallup polling. Why do you think that is? And maybe we can start with Melissa for this question.
If you look at that confidence level over the years, you'll really see it starting to go down when cable news became a lot more prolific. And the problem with trying to populate a news channel 24/7 is you start to mix in entertainment with information. So with the entertainmentification of news delivery on CNN, on MSNBC, on Fox, I really think that started to erode a lot of the trust that people had in those news institutions. Now, that's not to say that local or regional media is not immune from criticism, that we can't do things to improve. That's not it at all. And that's a very important part of the conversation that we need to have in building that trust with the public. But when you look at those polls, look at how they define the media. And are they talking about the same thing? When people think about the media, are they thinking about CNN? Are they thinking about the New York Times? Or are they thinking about the Idaho Press? Are they thinking about the Capital Sun? Are they thinking about Idaho Reports? It really depends on who you're asking and how the question is asked. You mentioned that, when you break down the confidence in institutions like Congress, that the closer the government official is to the person, that confidence level goes up. And the same is true with media sources. There was a 2019 Knight Foundation and Gallup poll that showed that people had higher levels of trust. They still weren't as high as I would hope they would be, but they did have much higher levels of trust in their local outlets. And so people aren't going to be looking at KIVI the same way they're looking at, say, the Rachel Maddow show.
Thank you, Brian. Do you have what can you add there?
So I think Melissa makes some good points, and I think that part of it is, recognizing that there's definitely some divides within perceptions of media. And if you look at the Gallup poll, right, there's a divide between D's and R's as to what their confidence and trust in the media is. But I think that, underneath it all, you can't look at the declining trust in the media without also observing that there is an ongoing decline in trust and confidence in institutions generally. And so if you think about the high point for U.S. government, for confidence in U.S. government, was right around 1962. And that was kind of on the heels of President Kennedy coming in and his "Ask Not What Your Nation Can Do for You" speech and all of those things. And we felt, as Americans, we felt pretty good about ourselves and about government. We were, still riding the high of the World War II victory and all of those things. Well, it started to decline, and you can trace the decline with Vietnam, and then it kind of hits this low point with Watergate, which I think, if anything, we could agree on, it's that Watergate probably reflects somewhat of a spot where we're like, hey, I'm not sure this government thing is going the way we want it to. But here's the dilemma. Government has never really recovered from that point. And when you look at the Gallup poll, right, trust in the media actually hits a high point in 1976. Well, it's the media that uncovered that whole thing. And then the media has also been kind of coordinatedly declining as an institution. And I'll be honest with you, when I look at the trusted media poll. I think about it as a trusted institutions poll. And the thing that is most concerning to me in my position is that we've always had this kind of suspicion of the executive branch and the congressional branch. The thing that's new is now all of a sudden we're seeing declining trust in the judicial branch. And that is relatively new. And to me, that's somewhat concerning. The other thing that I think it's really important to remember in these polls is the polls oftentimes track based on who's in office. And so, for example, if you have a Democrat in the executive, then Republicans' trust in government is going to be lower and vice versa. And so that becomes part of this as well. And to me, if I'm in the media, the thing that's probably most concerning to me is the size of the gap in the partisan trust of the media, right? Why is it that this many Democrats trust us, but not this many Republicans? And is that something that we as an institution can and should address? And how do we do that? And I think that, one of the issues that always comes to me is, how well does the media understand the topic that they're reporting on? And I can kind of give you a good example of this because we're going through this election season. And I'll be honest with you, I watch the debates. And one of the things that I watch within the debates is how well the folks running for office know what the office actually does. Sure. Recently, the Idaho Press covered the Secretary of State's debate. The headline on the coverage of their debate was 2 out of 3 candidates don't believe Biden won the election. And you may think, holy cow, how is that possible? The problem for me as somebody that reads the news is every time that headline is replicated, you add a few more people in that question the legitimacy of the Biden election. And so really what that comes down to for me is if this is a debate and an analysis of the candidates for Secretary of State, why are we leading with that headline? And then why does it take 6 paragraphs of that story to get to this? These theories have been widely discredited, including an audit by our own current Secretary of State, right? There's no line in there that says there have been 60 lawsuits, all of which have been found to have no merit. And I think that those are all elements that when you think about the media, what is the story that they're telling and what's the goal of the story that they're telling that we need to really closely analyze?
And
I think that's, go ahead, Melissa. No, please go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say, those are all really good points, Brian. And they're things that we constantly have conversations in newsrooms, certainly in my very small newsroom, about how to build trust with Republicans, how to build trust with the sources that we cover, because we do cover state government so closely. And, it's no secret that Idaho is a very, very red state. So our ability to navigate those conversations is critical for our survival as a news outlet. And it's the right thing to do as journalists too. It's not just a good financial decision to have the trust of conservative viewers or readers. It's the right thing to do as a journalist. We should be covering things accurately and fairly. But then at the same time, if a large group of our viewers, honest to goodness, does not believe that Biden is a fairly elected president, and then we have people who earnestly believe these conspiracy theories that, you're right, have been disproven many, many times, the very act of pointing that out will make some of the viewers and readers and listeners write us off immediately. And so
right.
There are some situations, and this isn't to defend or excuse anything, there are some situations when we're fighting against these forces of straight up BS all the time, that are making people who are making a lot of money for pushing conspiracy theories, and people who earnestly believe those conspiracy theories. I don't know that anyone has cracked the code on how to tear down those claims in a calm and confident way while also getting through to the people who earnestly believe those claims.
And just, before we go on to that, I read a book about why we believe in conspiracy theories, and it was like a psychology 101 class. But the thing about a conspiracy theory is that it can't be disproven, and that's what you're dealing with. And so I really appreciate your comments and understand the frustration when you're dealing with topics that they can't be disproven.
I think that, to your point, Jeremy, there have been definitive studies that have demonstrated that facts don't change minds, right? And I think that's what I call the journalism trap, right? Because the journalist is like, just the facts, and here's what happened, and this is it. But over and over, the way that minds are changed or persuaded is through one of two things. It's either a relationship or a good story. And those are the things. And I think that, one of the struggles that I think the press may be having right now is, how do we take these facts and turn them into the compelling story that we want to tell or are trying to tell? And I think, to Melissa's point, right, she's asking the question, right, are we telling the story in the way that we need to?
Right. I think that's really important, because one of the things that's questioned is whether or not the integrity of the story is standing true, right? It's supposed to be fact-based. It's supposed to be just about what really happened and not sensationalized. And yet so often it's questioned whether or not that is happening, and Brian, I think you make a solid point in that facts don't change minds, but yet you can't change the facts to your will either, though some try, especially those conspiracy theorists. So it's a tough position for the media to be in, almost a no-win. But with that being said, Melissa, you touched a little bit in your conversation on the fact that as you get closer to the people, both in the elected field, and I know Jeremy shared this in the polling, but also in the media reporting scene, that the trust increases somewhat. Do you think that's true here in Idaho? And if so, why or why not?
I do, especially in communities, in small communities that still depend on their weekly papers for news. And there are, here in the Treasure Valley, we take it for granted because we have so many good quality news sources that are available to us. But when I travel for work and go to places like Chalice or Salmon or Orofino, the number of news sources that cover their towns and their counties, it's one, maybe two outlets. And so in those small towns, you're going to run into the reporter at the grocery store. Even here in Boise, I'll run into viewers or sources when I go to the grocery store. We're likely to go to church together. We're likely to have kids in school together. The same isn't true with a New York Times reporter or Seattle Times or an LA Times reporter who parachutes in and covers a sensational election primary story, and we've seen plenty of those over the past few years. And some of them are good, and some of them, the reporter comes in and the tone tends to be, I traveled all over Idaho and I found a literate person to talk to, and they happen to have indoor plumbing. People pick up on that way that some of the national outlets look down on red states. It's not a secret. They don't hide that very well. And so, and there are some national reporters who have done a phenomenal job too, who are covering some of these issues. But local reporters are more likely to have that institutional knowledge to back up their reporting. They understand the issues that are playing into different issues in the community. And it doesn't have to just be about politics too. I think vaccine hesitancy is a perfect example from the last few years of why you really need reporters who understand the communities that they're covering, because vaccine hesitancy among Latinos who live in Canyon County, the reasons behind that are typically different than what you're going to find with residents who live in Wendell, like white conservative residents who live in Wendell, and their reasons for vaccine hesitancy are going to be different than people who live in Atlanta. And so it isn't just about politics. There are so many issues that the local reporters really understand, or they're better suited to understand the communities that they're covering. Again, too, if you have a problem with our reporting, we're easier to contact and we're easier to talk to about, like, hey, you know what, I think you missed the mark on this and here's why. And speaking just for myself, I really appreciate it when somebody takes the time to do that, because any journalist worth their salt is going to want to be as accurate and fair as possible. And so, I'm not talking about ridiculous troll comments online, but somebody who actually takes the time to reach out and say, you know what, I saw Idaho Reports on Friday night in this conversation that you did about transportation funding. I think you missed the mark on this and this and this, and here's why. And that often produces a really, really good conversation and story ideas for me. Or they might understand why I approached the story the way that I did. So all of that to say, you're more likely to have those relationships. You're more likely to have journalists with institutional knowledge and journalists who care about the communities that they cover. My kids go to school here. I drive on these roads. My parents are retiring in this state. And so I care very much about Idaho. And I have many reasons beyond just journalist ethics to want to get it right.
Wonderful. Brian, what about you? What do you think? You think that here in Idaho, there's a pretty good trust level amongst the media? And if so, why or why not?
So I would just echo Melissa's comments and observations. And I mean, if I were to add anything, again, it's the fact that a lot of the journalists within state and local government in Idaho have relationships with the folks that go back. I mean, I'll be honest with you. Like there are journalists that I go all the way back to the University of Idaho with, and remember them, writing for the Argonaut. And then, to Melissa's point, at various times, like I have literally run into other journalists on a run. So, I mean, it's like we're running into each other running. And then, daycare, I've had, my children have been in the same daycare. So you see them every single day at drop off and pickup. And I think that, to me, those relationships create and facilitate trust, which then says, oh, if I know this person in this capacity, then of course they're probably going to be accurate and writing things that I can read and trust at this level. The problem with the national media is it's not just the fact that they tend to, as Melissa put it, I think, look down on us in Idaho. It's that we also have no connection to them. I mean, I don't know who this person is that's calling me. And like, I know Melissa well enough that if she calls and asks our office for a comment and it's something that we can't comment on because it's pending litigation or something like that, I can say to her, look, I can't talk to you on the record, but if you've got questions about the process or something like that, I'm more than willing to explain what's happening to you on background. And again, right, that's facilitating that trusting relationship. And even though I can't give her necessarily what she's looking for, I can provide her with, as she put it, the basis to be like, are we getting the story right? And I think that, and I'm going to be honest, like on my side of the desk in the journalism equation, sometimes we're too quick to essentially shut the door to the journalist, right? Because we have a tendency to think, oh, they're out to get us. Right? They're looking for their gotcha moment, and I'm not going to facilitate a gotcha moment by helping them with anything. And I think that works. It works not just against the journalist, it works against the institution that we're trying to breathe confidence into. And I think that sometimes we forget about the fact that, the way that the news works, nobody knows what happens in our office unless somebody reports on it. And that's kind of government wide. And I will express to you my personal lament about reporting is government can do 1,000 things correctly in a day. You only hear about the one thing that goes wrong. And so I always have an issue of proportionality and whether that is part of why, confidence in government is also eroding. But I also know that nobody wants to buy a paper that says, hey, everything's great here, and it's some crazy like Truman Show recap. So I understand there's a balance, and I wish I had a solution, but I don't.
On the flip side of that too, Brian, like you said, government can do 1,000 things right, and everyone will focus on the one bad thing. Journalists can do 1,000 things right, but it only takes someone getting burned one time to erode their trust in the media, in all journalists, not just that one particular journalist. And that's something that I'm mindful of all the time. It's it's a big reason why I think that conversations about ethics and building trust are so critical, because most of the people that we talk to really aren't communications professionals. They don't understand things like on the record, off the record. And again, these folks are our neighbors. They're our fellow community members. And I want to cover things. I want to be accurate. I also want people to fully understand when they're talking to me, this is what's going on. I'm not interested in burning people. And I think that's a big part of the trust factor too, because it just takes getting burned one time to really sour that relationship with the media.
I can attest to that. I know there were times that I read things in the paper down home when I was a legislator that I'd go, when did that happen? I missed it, right? They say I was there, but I missed this one. Anyway, and from then on, it was like, well, why would I trust anything else I'm reading then in the same, this venue? I would read something about somebody else and I'd go, but I don't know if it's true, because how many times have I read something about me that wasn't true? So you're spot on, Melissa. You're right.
No, I appreciate that. That was I learned a little bit there. I enjoyed that. Can let's talk a little bit more about those journalistic ethics and their impact on confidence in local reporting. I mean, basically, do you believe those ethics positively influence civility in public discourse? Maybe we can start with you, Melissa, on that one.
I guess I'll say that every worthwhile journalist, again, takes ethics very, very seriously. There are constant conversations about what ethical journalism is, because new situations will present themselves all the time. And the mainstream media's view on ethics is constantly evolving as we learn more about things like trauma-informed reporting and how to interview people in a way that doesn't take advantage of the trauma that they may have experienced. And this comes up in so many ways when we are talking about sexual assault, when we're talking about violent crime. It's a topic that is constantly evolving. And again, especially when we're talking about our fellow community members in relatively small or very small communities in Idaho, that matters. It really, really matters, because if you're covering an alleged sexual assault, the way you treat the parties in how you're working with them, how you're writing about them, how you report on the allegations, people notice that. Fellow survivors notice that, and that matters.
I appreciate that. Brian, what are your thoughts?
So I'm going to go a little bit different direction. I think that Melissa raises really important points. And the one thing that I want to build on that she said is, I think that when we talk about ethics, you can't leave ethics in the background. They have to become front and center. Otherwise, it's just something that people talk about, but nobody really understands or has any depth to. And so, to what Melissa said, right, the discussions that occur on ethics within the newsroom, they need to find their way to the front page. They need to find their way to the table that they're sitting around on Idaho Report, so that we can hear it and understand, oh, these are the considerations that they factor in. This is why they decided it. I'm going to reveal my inner geek here a little bit, but one of my favorite columns that used to be on ESPN.com was they used to have an ombudsman, and the ombudsman would write kind of this ongoing commentary and critique of ESPN's coverage of certain sports stories. Now, for a variety of reasons, they no longer have that function, but I found it fascinating it gave you kind of a peek behind the curtain as to how the coverage is formulated, what the factors are when they consider what to cover and how to cover it. And to me, like, that's one of those things that I would love to see find its way into reporting. Like, why do you report the stories that you do? How do you report it? What are the factors that make you determine, yes, we're going to run this story, or no, we're going to sit on it? And then I think that, to me, I understand that journalists have a code of ethics. I understand that attorneys have a code of ethics. The legislature has a code of ethics. But what are they? Like, let's get those out and in front and say, hey, here's the journalist code of ethics, and this is what we adhere to. And I know that over the years, various news outlets have kind of published their code of ethics. But I think that that's something that, if people were like, hey, Brian, what should we do? How would you run the world? One of the things that I would say is, let's go get that sort of stuff out front and center a little bit more often and not shy away from the discussion. One of the things that often happens is we love to have ethics training and we love to talk about, oh, we've got high ethics. But if you never revisit your ethics and have that discussion, it just becomes another thing that sits on the shelf that is a reference instead of being front and center and facilitating that conversation. You also have to be willing to have the conversation. Meaning, is there somebody sitting in your newsroom that's like, hey, I know we got a great story here, but are we sure we're doing it the way that it needs to be done? And oftentimes we as humans look at those sorts of folks and say, oh, they're just making the meeting last longer. Let's not have that discussion. But that's a really important element. And that's one of the ways that we can avoid those bear traps and breathe confidence into the jobs that we're doing.
I like that. I was just having a conversation with a family member about this, and not ethics, but principles, and how we constantly want to live up to those principles, but we're also human beings, and how important it is to revisit those, to have them be front and center just in our lives. And of course, that's the same principle you're talking, Brian, with professional ethics. It's something that you have to engage with in meaningful ways regularly to not lose sight of them. So I really appreciate that.
So I want to shift gears just a little bit and take us to social media, whole different world. And I bet, Melissa, kind of how I felt about it as a legislator too. But with stories being shared on social platforms, where obviously the public can comment, right, and often do, what are the engagement expectations from media employers on how to respond to negative comments and trolling? And is there an expectation of civil discourse / respect? Should there be an expectation of civil discourse and respect in that realm? And whoever wants to start first is welcome to, Brian or Melissa.
I'll defer to Melissa.
Okay, Melissa, kick us off.
All right. So media outlet to media outlet, it varies on what social media policies are. And, just like with everything else, that's constantly evolving as the way people interact with social media and use social media. Those policies are constantly being updated and evolving. I know that my own personal philosophy on it has changed over the years. I used to be a lot more active on social media. I would reply to a lot of comments, both positive and negative. I would really try to have like a discourse out in the open. If I had particularly unkind trolls, I would call them out publicly, because part of that too was wanting to show what kind of harassment journalists receive, but especially it's so much worse. And we have the data to show this. It's so much worse for journalists of color. It's so much worse for openly GLBTQ journalists, and certainly women have a lot of harassment in there too. And so I used to be in there punching it up, and now I don't. Now I mute or block people, and I've really stopped using social media except to just post stories. And it's a shame because I've had some really good interactions with people over the years on social media, with viewers who want to engage more, who have questions about, you know, what we're covering, or a process that's going on in the legislature that they don't fully understand. And there were some really good positive things about it, but the net negative has just been bigger and bigger lately. It's more overwhelmingly negative. The noise is drowning out some of the good stuff. And so my employer doesn't require me to reply to everybody on Twitter, certainly, and thank goodness for that. We have somebody on our team who keeps an eye on Facebook comments and responds when appropriate. And usually it'll be questions, right? Like, why are you covering this? Or, I heard this about hospital capacity during the last COVID surge. Is it true? Those are things that when people have genuine questions, we really, really want to try and engage with those. But the real unfortunate thing about social media is that the noise is just drowning out everything else in the past few years. And it's completely changed the way that I interact with it, which means that it's changing the way that I interact with viewers of Idaho Public Television. But there are some very well-paid trolls out there who have made it their living to, I'm always happy to have a legitimate conversation about our coverage, the guests that we have, the topics that we cover. If people pick up the phone and call me or email me, I am so happy to have those conversations. I'm happy to do panels like this. Twitter isn't the place to have those conversations, and it's a shame because it could be a really fun, neat tool. And it has been in the past, but not anymore.
Right, I agree. If people could just be respectful, right, and be reasonable in their questions and their replies, in the recognizing that there's always going to be different views, and that's all right. That should be welcome. But you're right; it could be a really cool tool. Brian, anything to add about social media platforms?
So I agree with everything that's been said. I think that, to me, the big question that I always have when I look at comments is this a comment that's being advanced because this person wants to engage in the discussion, or is this a comment that's being advanced because the person simply wants attention? And I think that, and this kind of goes to Melissa's point, right? There's a number of folks out there that they don't want to engage in the discussion. They just want the attention. And a lot of times the way that you get attention is you say something extremely inflammatory, and then everybody kind of piles back at you, and that gives you yet another entry point to continue that discussion. And I think that, to me, social media is one of those areas where we have to both self-police and be self-discreet, right? Yes, I see this, but then can I also have the discretion not to respond to whatever the bomb is that's getting thrown? And it's not that discretion to not respond. That might be one of the most difficult things to do as a human, right? I'm not going to respond to this because I recognize it's simply attention-seeking behavior. I think that all of us who are parents recognize attention-seeking behavior versus a legitimate complaint or cry from our children. And the internet unfortunately is much the same thing, although at times it might be a little bit trickier to discern because you don't know the internet as well as your family members. And sometimes, I hate to say it, right? We're in the very awkward position of the troll is a family member, and so how do you handle that situation? But I think that, to me, I think that your concluding thought, Kelly, is the right one, right? The expectation of civil discourse. And it's one of those things that, all of us that are in good faith using these mediums, right? If we share the same expectation of civil discourse and we can generally agree on what civil discourse should look and feel like, well, maybe that's one of the ways that we can bridge these gaps. I think the more difficult issue that you've got with social media is that there's no filter on what you can put out there. And so when you think about our beginning question of trust and confidence in the media, to what extent does the ability that I can put whatever I want out onto social media undermine our confidence and trust in media because they're not necessarily all rowing in the same direction?
No, those are great comments. I watched and I can't remember the Senate committee, but there was Senator Kuhn and Senator Sass are the chairs and minority of a certain Senate committee, and they were holding an information session on how Congress should work with social media, and I think the main drive of it was to say should Congress regulate, or should they just ask for access to algorithms to be able to study the effects of social media on our society and institutions? And Jonathan Haidt, a professor at NYU, commented that there's 4 groups of people that really benefit from the way that they have this rancor, that there are people that they're on the far right, the people are on the far left. There are predominantly men with mental illness issues that get joy from trolling online, and Russian bots and it's made it to a spot where everybody, the 90%, 80 to 90% of the rest of us don't feel comfortable engaging. And to Melissa's point, it becomes it's not worthwhile to engage. And so these are all issues that our leadership are looking at and trying to figure out what the next step is to deal with those issues. So thanks for those comments. Really, really enjoyed those. Our next question is, what are some of the strategies you would use or recommend when faced with those comments online? And do you have any examples of what you've seen personally that you used to diffuse some of those tough situations? Yeah.
And I've been on the receiving end of so many online comments, and again, if I feel like there's a question in there that is in good faith, or if somebody genuinely wants to engage, then I will try to calmly reply to them. But more and more, we're seeing confrontations happen in real life too. It's not just online, but journalists, whether they're at the State House or they're at protests or, covering health board meetings or whatever, a lot of times we'll have members of the public confront them, or we'll try, my colleagues in the press corps have had people try to antagonize them and flip on their cell phone cameras. And the goal is to get somebody, to lose their cool and have a moment go viral, and remembering that is the goal, and not giving them what they want, just staying very, very calm and professional, whether it's online or in person. That's what I tell my team at work, and new journalists that I work with. And it's what I really try to remember, because I've been in some very tense situations where I've covered rallies and protests, and I've had people in my face yelling at me and asking me why I hate America or whatever, and sometimes those have resulted in really good conversations when I just calmly point out, I'm here and I'm here to talk to you, and I'm here to cover this story and get your thoughts. Sometimes they'll just walk away and ignore that, but sometimes it's resulted in really good conversations. And so just being grounded and remembering the purpose of why I'm there in the first place or why I'm in that situation, especially if it's in person. When it's online, it's easy to just close out of that window and walk away, right? But the same principle applies, right? Remembering too, and recognizing if they want an actual legitimate interaction or if they just want to get a rise out of you.
No, I like that. Brian?
So Melissa actually just did a beautiful demonstration of the maxim, don't get furious, get curious. And I think that when you're interacting at this level, right, that's a really good reminder. Don't get furious, get curious. Ask why, right? Ask for the reasoning and find out what their motivations are. And again, when you're talking about being persuasive, one of the best ways to persuade someone is not to tell them the answer. It's to ask them questions to help them find the answer. But within our kind of confrontational spheres, we don't always have the patience to ask the questions to lay the groundwork for that, which I think, so I generally start from curious, not furious. Then the next level that I like to go to is I shouldn't say always, I try to think in terms of, is this person saying what they're saying out of malice or ignorance? Meaning, does this person say this because they want to hurt me or the idea or the person behind it? Or are they saying it because they simply don't know any better? And how can you get them to kind of understand that? I throw out those two really great kind of positive platitudes with this third caution. And the caution is sometimes neither one of those things work because you're dealing with what I call motivated reasoning, meaning the reason has a goal in mind. And to me, this really brings up one of the kind of deeper societal questions that we should all be thinking about. And that is, what is honesty to us and how comfortable are we with dishonesty? Right. And we've kind of classically been trained. There's two types of lies out there. There's the black lie, which is completely dishonest and it's for malicious motives. Right. Did you steal that $20? No. And they did steal it. That's a black lie. Right. Versus the white lie. Right. Does this tie make my face look fat? Hopefully you're all going to say no. But that's something that we're going to say. We say that, right, because we don't want to hurt the other person's feelings, right? And that's an acceptable lie. And so one of the things that you always have to think about is, how honest are we as a society? Because there's a certain level of dishonesty that is not only acceptable, but it's actually preferred, right? Because if we walked around and told people exactly what we think, we probably wouldn't get along as well as we do. There's a third lie that's perhaps even more dangerous than those two. And it's a lie that's been called by some writers a blue lie. And the blue lie is when you perpetuate a dishonest statement in order to further your cause, which is why I started with motivated reasoning. And I think that when you put all of those things together, right, you can really see what's kind of unfolding within the online space, within even journalism to some degree, and the way that entities are using journalism to advance their causes. And it's that blue lie that really runs the thread of what we're seeing societally undermine it, meaning this dishonesty is perfectly acceptable as long as it furthers the cause that I'm in favor of.
No, I appreciate that.
Wow, powerful. I actually learned a lot right then. Had never heard about the blue lie, but I've seen it in play a lot. Didn't realize that that's what it was called. And I love that, curious rather than furious. That would have helped me a lot during the legislature. Maybe it'll help me next legislative session when I'm doing my responsibilities for the association.
If I can say it's a lot easier to say than to do.
Oh my word. Well, the one I was taught by my parents is act, don't react. And I react quite often. So it's like, just act, Kelly, don't react. But curious instead of furious, maybe that'll help me. I love it. So real quickly, let's wrap up with our final questions, which is about how consumers can be confident in the news that they're consuming, especially, I would say, in an online platform, because as you just mentioned, Brian, so often people are putting out, they're perpetuating maybe false stories and false narratives. And so how can people be assured that they're getting their news from a trusted source, one, whether that's in the traditional media or in these online platforms?
Media literacy is a topic that we've heard and discussed more and more in recent years, especially again with the rise in social media and how people are using it to share information or disinformation. One of the best things you can do is think critically about what you're reading. Is it verifiable? Is this the only place where you're hearing it? Getting your news from a variety of sources too, and not relying on a social media algorithm to feed them to you, but going straight to the website, whether it's straight to Idaho Ed News or the Idaho Statesman or KTVB or wherever. Getting it straight from the reporters, but again, looking at how those media outlets conduct themselves over time. To your point from earlier, Kelly, when you were talking about how you saw misinformation regularly in one of your local papers, how do those media outlets respond to criticism? Do they publicly correct when they get things wrong? Do they acknowledge that they've made mistakes? Those are all a pattern of trust that they can build or not build, and paying attention to that and how they define their ethics and how they conduct themselves with the public, and what sort of humility there is when they're acknowledging that they could have done better. Those are all things to keep in mind beyond just the daily stories that you're reading or listening to.
Brian, anything to add?
Yeah, I would add, so number one, I am a huge fan of the multiple sources thought. And I actually would add to that multiple mediums. Like one of the things that I do, like I don't just read the newspaper and read the online articles, but I also go out and listen to podcasts that like discuss things that I'm more deeply interested in. And then additionally, I'll, you go out and maybe, to me, that's one of the things to really think about is where are you getting the news and what's the depth of the news that you're getting, because that becomes important. And I think that goes to my second point, which is whatever your source is, and I'll even use sources, don't be afraid to think critically about what's being reported to you and what's in those sources. In every story, there are two sides to it, and the way that the story is told depends on the perspective, right? I mean, there's a lot of truth to history is written by the victors, and I think that we can't lose sight of those sorts of elements. I think that to me, if we think all the way back to our first question, right, what's underlying some of the erosion of trust within the media? One of the things that's underlying that erosion of trust is the Google generation. Meaning, if I have a question, I can just look it up on Google and get the answer. I don't have to stop and reason through it. And I'll be honest, one of my favorite things when I was younger was you would throw a question out in like a bar over a beer or maybe over lemonade or whatever it was. And it would be like a trivia question that you didn't really know the answer to it. Everybody would have an answer and then you debate what the answer was. And then maybe some enterprising person would go back and find the answer and confirm it. But we don't do that anymore, right? You get into that same debate and you're like, what was the number one song off of the Dire Straits album? It's like, oh, here it is on Google. We have the answer. And I think that to me, it's you lose that debate, but that also means we're losing that critical thinking element. Meaning, if we anticipate that Google will spoon feed us the answer, do we have that same expectation of the media? And does that lack of trust reflect when, oh, the media didn't give us exactly the answer we were looking for? And is that all interwoven? And so I think that we can't ever lose sight of, yes, we need multiple sources. Yes, we need to think critically. And then finally, never be afraid to question whatever those conclusions are that you reach, because some small change in a fact could change that conclusion. And are you open to that?
Well, I love that thought. Melissa, did you have any other thoughts before we wrapped up the program?
I just wanted to reemphasize one of the things I said earlier, which is I wasn't kidding when I said most journalists want to hear from their readers, their listeners, their viewers, and especially their sources. If you feel like we didn't get something right, I want to keep that channel of communication open. You can find my email address online. We're pretty easy to get a hold of, and so truly, most journalists I know are very approachable, and they're very willing to have those conversations. And I really like what Brian brought up about, maybe we need to take more initiative and be more transparent about the decisions that we make when it does come to coverage, because we're not above reproach. We're not immune to criticisms. We're not above those criticisms, but I would like to see them in a constructive way, so we can actually have that conversation as opposed to, random troll comments online. And so please reach out to me. I'm easy to reach most of the time. So, and thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.
Well, Kelly and I want to thank both Melissa and Brian very much for being such wonderful guests today and for having this important discussion. And everyone who's seen this live and will see it on repeat in social media, really hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. We'd also like to thank our partners, the Association of Idaho Cities. This partnership with the Association of Idaho Cities. Kelly, this was something that she thought up of last year, for a little before last year, but started implementing it January 2021. And because social media hasn't been the great place to have these kind of long form discussions about sensitive issues and how we can improve as a human race and communities, this is a wonderful thing that the Chamber and the Association of Idaho Cities tries to do to have really good informed discussion on important issues. So a special thank you also to our media partners, the Idaho Ed News, the Idaho Statesman, the Idaho Press, and as well as the Idaho Capital Sun. So we are so grateful for their partnership as well. And with that, we will look forward to seeing you on the next In Search of Civility.